The German Nazi Party were always a fringe party, and they were always considered a bit of a joke. But under Adolf Hitler and his charismatic leadership, this party would not only seize power in 1933, but consolidate it to become the biggest and most powerful party in the Reichstag. The incredible rise to power of the Nazi Party is mirrored by that of only Adolf Hitler himself. His incredible story of how he went from being a homeless, out-of-work painter to becoming the leader of the biggest party and emperor of Germany is absolutely remarkable. It was his leadership that led the Nazis to success. But who was this man? Who was Adolf Hitler? Where did he come from? Adolf Hitler was born on the 20th of April 1889 to a poor family in Austria, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Hitler was said to be an outgoing boy until his brother Edmund died of measles. This had an effect on the young Hitler, and he became more detached, more morose, and started fighting with his father and teachers at school. When Hitler got older, he wanted to be an art student, so he applied to go to art college in Vienna. Unfortunately, they rejected him, and eventually, after his mother died of breast cancer, he ended up being homeless on the streets. Hitler was forced to borrow money and live a homeless existence, but eventually his fortunes would change when World War I came along. During World War I, Hitler was incredibly lucky. He survived an attack which saw his entire section get wiped out, and eventually he was promoted to the rank of corporal. Later on, Hitler left his dugout in his trench, and it was then hit by a direct shell, killing everybody. He'd missed death again by seconds. But his greatest escape came when Private Tandy, an English soldier, was attacking the Germans and had Hitler in his sights. But Hitler was unarmed, and Private Tandy lowered his weapon. Hitler cheated death so many times that he began to think that he was destined for bigger things, and fate was on his side. During his time at the front, Hitler volunteered to run messages from one line to another. This was an incredibly dangerous job. He had to ride a bicycle under fire. Hitler survived and delivered the message, and eventually, because Germany were looking to inspire the men, they decided to make him a hero and give him the Iron Cross, one of the highest medals in the German army. By 1918, the German front line was collapsing. Their failed offensive, the British blockade, and the Americans coming into the war all turned things against them. They were running out of raw materials, and Hitler himself ended up getting gassed and going temporarily blind. It was at this moment, at his lowest point in a German hospital, Hitler received the news. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. Hitler couldn't believe it. All that sacrifice, all those men's lives lost. For what? Defeat. It seemed to Hitler like his entire world had collapsed. He felt let down by the generals. He felt betrayed. After the war, Germany was in chaos, with the communist parties, the workers' parties, roaming the streets fighting each other. But Hitler stayed in the army, and he was given the job to spy on these parties and report on them for the army. He went to the local beer halls and listened to men making speeches, but to his surprise, he actually agreed with them. And it wasn't long before he started standing on a table and making a speech himself about the war and how the generals had lost the war for Germany. Hitler got a round of applause and realized he had a talent for making speeches. It wasn't long before he got introduced to the members of the National Socialist Workers' Party, or Nazis as they would become known. One of the men he met was Dietrich Eckart. He would become key in Hitler's life. Eckart saw the talent in Hitler and the passion, and started to believe that he could be the chosen one that he was looking for. Eckart introduced Hitler to the Nazi Party and allowed him to make more speeches, and eventually he bought Hitler a car and a place to live, even bought him a suit so he would look smart and more presentable. He wanted Hitler to be the chief speechmaker for the Nazi Party. He also introduced Hitler to Ernst Röhm. Röhm was the leader of the SA. Röhm had started his own organisation. He had access to firearms, manpower, and most importantly, he was the security force for the Nazi Party. When the communists tried to break up Hitler's speeches, Röhm was there with his SA, former ex-soldiers. They would act as security for the Nazis, beat up the communists, and allow Hitler to make his speech. Back then, German politics was a battleground, and Hitler needed men like Röhm and his SA to keep order. Röhm and his group of SA brown shirts were formidable street fighters. They were feared throughout Germany. They may have been crude bullies, but they were essential for Hitler and his rise to power, and for the security of the Nazis. As Hitler rose higher in the Nazi Party, eventually he was introduced to Hermann Göring, a World War I fighter ace and war hero. Göring was well known in Germany. Being a war hero, he was popular, and the Nazis needed that popularity in order to further their cause. Göring was jovial, ostentatious. He was not only a handsome, popular war hero, but the people really loved him. He was exactly the kind of man the Nazis needed. Göring would also give the Nazis access to other high-ranking members of the military, such as Ludendorff, a former World War I general. As Eckart moulded Hitler into the leader he wanted him to be, the Nazi Party got bigger and stronger. Hitler was making speech after speech, getting rousing receptions. And with men like Göring in his corner, Hitler's profile in politics was rising. And with Rome protecting him, Hitler was becoming a star in the Nazi Party. Thanks to officers like Hermann Göring, they now had access to higher-ranking members of the military, such as Ludendorff, a World War I commander and one of the biggest and famous names in Germany. Hitler didn't care about politics. He wanted to take over the German government. He wanted to use all the anarchy and all the upheaval in Germany after the war to take power by force in a coup, using force of arms. And with powerful figures like Göring and Ludendorff, he thought he had the right men for the job. The Nazi Party had grown and expanded, and they also had the SA and Rome and his brown shirts. Surely they could take power by force. Hitler was a big fan of Benito Mussolini, the dictator of Italy. He had taken power by force, so Hitler believed he could do it too. And in what became known as the Beer Hall Putsch, he would try to do just that. On the 8th of November 1923, Hitler and the SA and his entourage stormed a public meeting. With weapons, Hitler fired a pistol into the ceiling before shouting, "The National Revolution has begun." Ludendorff and Göring were also in attendance, and they rounded up some of the politicians and tried to convince them at gunpoint to join their cause. Eventually they agreed, and everyone started celebrating and drinking beer. Unfortunately for the Nazis, one of the politicians escaped, and he managed to round up the military and the police and warned them that Hitler and his entourage were on their way. Hitler, Göring, and the SA were all marching towards the Bavarian War Ministry. They were hoping the police and army would join them, but unfortunately it didn't happen. And as they closed in on the ministry, they saw the German army waiting there with their rifles pointing straight at them. Hitler, Göring and their men linked arms and they carried on marching, but the Germans opened fire. Hitler was almost killed. A bullet narrowly missed his head. Göring was shot in the leg. The rest of the SA ran for their lives. Some returned fire, but the whole thing quickly degenerated into a farce. Over the next few days, many arrests were made, but Göring managed to escape. He got out of the country quickly before anyone could find him. But Hitler, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. Hitler was charged with trying to overthrow the German government. But when he was in the dock, facing life behind bars, Hitler did what he did best. He made a speech. Hitler portrayed himself as a war hero who just wanted to save his country and was desperate to turn things around. The judge had great sympathy with him, and in the end, he got a lighter sentence. Hitler got 5 years, but only served 9 months. Rudolf Hess was one of Hitler's most loyal men. He had an almost sycophantic admiration for Adolf Hitler. And during his time in prison, Hess would help Hitler write his book. Mein Kampf, or My Struggle, was Hitler's autobiography, but it was also his manifesto for the future. And in the book, we saw the first leanings towards anti-Semitism. Initially, the book didn't sell well, but by the time the Nazis came to power in the 30s, it sold 1 million copies in a year. Many dismissed the book as the ramblings of a madman, but others liked what Hitler had to say. Hitler was beginning to use the Jews as a scapegoat for all of Germany's problems. In prison, Hitler had time to think, and he realised he couldn't take power by force. If he wanted power, he would have to do it the political way, and he had to distance himself from bully boys like the SA. Rome was trying to build up the Nazi Party and the SA for another coup, but Hitler didn't want that. Hitler was determined to make the Nazis a serious political party. If they were going to seize power, they would do it by vote. Whilst Hitler was in prison, he heard about Dr. Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels had joined the Nazi Party because he saw Hitler and became fascinated by him. Goebbels was making incredible speeches. Like Hitler, he spoke with passion and authority. Hitler was determined to meet this man, and when he was finally released from prison, that's what he did. Eventually, he became the best man at Goebbels' wedding. Goebbels was exactly the kind of man Hitler wanted. He was intelligent and respected and passionate. Goebbels was the kind of man Hitler wanted in his new inner circle. By the time Hitler was released from prison, the economic situation in Germany had greatly improved thanks to American bailouts. The Nazi message of economic doom was no longer in touch with the people, so the Nazis did very poorly at their first elections. People were having a great time at the end of the 1920s. They didn't want the Nazis and their message of economic doom to bring them down. The fact is, Hitler and the Nazis were beginning to look out of touch with the people and outdated. Despite that, Hitler brought back Goering, and with Goebbels and his inner circle, he campaigned relentlessly for the next general elections. But again, the Nazis did poorly. But in 1929 came the Wall Street crash. The American economy collapsed, and it took Germany with it. Overnight, the German people were plunged into poverty. Hitler now looked like a prophet. He had said that Germany should not rely on American bailouts, that they had to rebuild their economy themselves, and he had been proved right. Suddenly, the Nazis became more popular. Nazi party membership began to soar, and Hitler and the Nazis looked like the only party who actually knew what it was doing. And with their new military-style Hugo Boss uniforms, the Nazis were beginning to look like a party of the future, a party that the Germans could trust, a party that could get them out of trouble. Adolf Hitler was beginning to look like the man the Germans needed to lead them. Hitler's inner circle was incredibly strong. Goebbels was an expert at propaganda. He used radio and posters and newspapers to try and make the Nazis look stronger and greater than ever. Hess was the deputy leader of the party. Goering was the bombastic war hero. And Hitler was head of the party and the chosen prophet. He even brought back Rome and installed him again as head of the SA. Hitler realized now, in the 1930s, he would have a great opportunity to seize power. Hitler even created his own elite bodyguard unit known as the SS and chose Heinrich Himmler as the leader. He may not have looked the part, but Himmler was incredibly diligent and well organized. He was the perfect man to run Hitler's elite bodyguard unit. He was both feared and respected. With Goebbels, Goering, Hess and Himmler, Hitler and the Nazis were unstoppable, and they soon had the most seats in the German parliament, known as the Reichstag. Despite the popularity of the Nazis, they had a major problem. That problem was Paul von Hindenburg. He had been a commander in World War I and was now the president of Germany. And he hated Hitler. He despised him and the Nazis. However, there was one thing he hated more than the Nazis, and that was the Communist Party. He saw them as a real threat to Germany. So in the end, he was forced to decide between the Nazis and the Communists. And in the end, he joined forces with Hitler. However, there was a condition. Hitler would be made Chancellor, but first he had to get rid of the Communist Party. So Hitler had to come up with a plan. In the meantime, Hindenburg would carry on ruling Germany with his antiquated, out-of-date style, whilst the Nazis were kept waiting in the wings. However, Hitler had time on his side. He was the leader of the biggest party in the German parliament, and he also knew that Hindenburg was an old man. Sooner or later, Hindenburg would die, and Hitler would be waiting in the wings to grasp the power and take over as leader of Germany. Hitler now had real political power, so he decided to unleash the SA and use them as a tool of oppression against the Jewish community. The SA would openly bully Jews in the streets. They even organised boycotts of any Jewish-owned business. Most Germans were horrified. In fact, the boycotts were only partially successful, and many scientists and authors and intellectuals began to see Hitler and the Nazis for what they really were. Over the next few years, many Germans began to leave the country. With Goebbels spreading hatred across the radio waves and the SA spreading hatred in the streets, the Jews found life almost unbearable. Eventually, they organised book burnings against the Jews, burning any book that was written by a Jew. All Jewish literature and culture would be purged from German society. Not everyone could afford to leave Germany, and some even joined the Nazi Party out of fear. They didn't want to stand against the Nazis, so they joined them. The Nazi Party wanted to attract doctors and lawyers, businessmen. They were looking for intellectuals, intelligent people who could further their cause. In fact, many people joined the Nazi Party just to further their careers. They wanted to get to the top, so they became members of the Nazi Party. One of the books that was thrown on the fire that night was written by a Jewish poet who once said, "Where you burn books, you eventually burn people." But thanks to the endless propaganda, young people were turning against Jewish culture. They were beginning to despise and hate the Jews, blaming them for everything. The biggest threat to the Nazis and Hitler wasn't the Jews. It was actually the Communist Party. They were growing in size and strength. But on February the 27th, 1933, the Reichstag, the German parliament building, mysteriously caught fire. Immediately, a bunch of communists were rounded up and arrested and accused of the crime. Hitler used the fire as an excuse to ban the Communist Party and have all of its leaders arrested and sent to concentration camps. In one move, Hitler had destroyed the opposition. Many believed it was a setup. They thought the Nazis had started the fire in order to frame the Communist Party so they could get rid of them. And that may have been true. The Communists were a threat to the Nazis, but now they were gone. In one single move, Hitler had destroyed the biggest opposition party to the Nazis in Germany. After getting rid of the Communist Party, Hitler turned his attention to Rome and the SA. They were becoming an embarrassment, nothing more than bullies. They'd upset the German public, so Hitler could no longer be associated with them. He realised Rome was nothing more than an enforcer, just a hammer, and Hitler needed a more skillful political tool. Rome had outlived his usefulness. Hitler no longer needed him. And the fact was, he was an openly homosexual man. This enraged Hitler. And both Goering and Goebbels tried to turn Hitler against Rome more by suggesting that he was planning to take over the Nazi Party. This wasn't true, but it didn't matter. Hitler had to act. He saw Rome's blatant homosexuality as an affront to everything he stood for. He saw it as a threat to the young youth of Germany. And when Hitler was informed Rome was openly having sex with young boys in the SA, he was furious and determined to act. Using the SS and the newly formed Gestapo, his secret police, Hitler decided to get rid of not only Rome and the leaders of the SA, but all of his political rivals in one move. In what would become the Night of the Long Knives, murder would explode across Germany. On the 30th of June 1934, Hitler ordered a series of executions to be carried out by his elite bodyguard, the SS. Over 150 people would be killed. Many leaders of the SA were arrested and then tortured to death, either garroted or shot in the back of the head. President Hindenburg turned a blind eye as Hitler cleaned house, exterminating the leaders of the SA. When Rome himself was arrested, Hitler was there in person. With gun in hand, he stormed into Rome's room and found him in bed with a man. Hitler was enraged and disgusted, and he ordered the half-dressed Rome to be dragged away and thrown in a cell. Eventually, Rome was given a gun with one bullet. He was expected to do the decent thing and shoot himself, but he refused. He wouldn't play Hitler's game. Eventually, 2 SS men came to his cell, and he was shot dead. His last words were "Heil Hitler." Right-wing politician and critic of Hitler, Ritter von Kahr, was also arrested, beaten and eventually shot dead. The former Chancellor of Germany, General von Schleicher, was arrested at his house. He was shot dead along with his wife. Joseph Goebbels would later claim that von Schleicher was in a plot to overthrow Hitler, but this of course wasn't true. Gregor Strasser, the former leader of the Nazi Party, was also a target for Hitler. He too was arrested and executed. He was shot in the back whilst he was in his cell and left to bleed to death. It took over an hour for Strasser to die. Hitler had not only wiped out the leaders of the SA, he killed writers, politicians, critics. Anyone who knew anything bad about him was exterminated. Goebbels controlled all media, so he spread a story around Germany to the people, saying that these individuals were all involved in trying to overthrow the Nazi government. Many believed his lies, many didn't, but it didn't matter, the Nazis were in control. On the 2nd of August 1934, Hitler got the moment he was waiting for. President Paul von Hindenburg had died. Hindenburg had always been an obstacle in Hitler's way, but now he was gone, Hitler got rid of the title of president and instead created a new title for himself, Führer of Germany. This would in fact make him the emperor of the country. Hitler decided that the German soldiers should not swear allegiance to Germany, but they should swear allegiance to him instead. This meant every member of the armed forces would have to swear an oath of loyalty to Hitler himself. After the Night of the Long Knives, Hitler had killed all of his enemies, politicians, journalists, the leaders of the SA, generals, anyone who stood in his way had been mercilessly wiped out. And now with the death of President Hindenburg and with the Communist Party disbanded, there was no one left to stand in Hitler's way. He had become supreme leader of Germany. Hitler's rise to power was remarkable. He'd gone from being an art student to being homeless, to being a war hero, to being a politician, to being a prisoner, to being Chancellor of Germany, to being Emperor of the German people. Hitler had used his inner circle, men like Himmler, Goering and Goebbels, to spread hatred and fear of the Jews. He decapitated the leadership of the SA, replacing it with his own elite bodyguard force, the SS. And now he had the entire German army swear allegiance to him. He'd also created a secret police force known as the Gestapo that started wiretaps and collecting information on any enemy of the state. The Nazis controlled the radio waves, they controlled newspapers, they controlled everything, and they could use it to spread their propaganda, scaring people and striking fear into the hearts of their enemies. Germany had become nothing more than a dictatorship. However, the people still had to vote, and many voted for the Nazis out of fear. They felt like they had no choice. They had no alternative. But some voted for Hitler because he seemed like a competent politician, a great leader, the chosen one, a man who would lead Germany back to greatness. To the outside world, Hitler looked like a brilliant leader who was trying to modernize Germany and turn it into a great country, a kind of utopia for the people. And people began to become fanatical about the Nazis and fanatical about their leader, Adolf Hitler. Hitler believed children were the future, so he started Hitler Youth programs. That way he could create an army loyal to him, an army of children who would grow up to be fanatical soldiers willing to fight and die for the fatherland. Hermann Goering, the former World War I pilot, was now the head of the Gestapo, but he was soon appointed to being head of the German Air Ministry as Hitler looked to rebuild the German Air Force. Goebbels, of course, was Minister for Propaganda. He was now in charge of the cinema and radio. He made films about the Nazis. He made films about the greatness of Germany, whilst also having sex with actresses behind his wife's back. Many German actresses were forced to have sex with Goebbels in order to further their career on his casting couch. Rudolf Hess was one of Hitler's most loyal men, and he was now awarded the title of Deputy Führer. After the Wall Street crash, Germany was making a miraculous recovery, and many people decided it was because of the Nazis. They believed the Nazis were responsible for turning Germany around, bringing down unemployment, rebuilding the country, and eventually building, of course, the world's first motorway, known as the Autobahn. This was a real feat of German engineering. Others believed that by the time the Nazis came to power in 1933, Germany was already beginning to recover, but the Nazis took full credit. They were very quick to capitalise on any economic success, and on top of this they were beginning to rebuild everything, including the Air Force and the military. Germany was on the rise, and the German cinema under Joseph Goebbels made sure everyone knew it was all down to Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. When the very first motorway was complete, it became the only one in the world. The Autobahn was a technical marvel, and Germany was now looking like a country of the future. Other countries were looking on with envy at what Adolf Hitler and the Nazis were doing. It seemed like Adolf Hitler was a great leader, and the Nazi Party was the best thing that happened to Germany. Hitler also wanted to rebuild Berlin. He made an elaborate model of what he wanted Berlin to look like. This was the Berlin of the future. This was the Germany of the future. This was the Third Reich. Hitler saw the Germanic people as superior to all other races. He started youth programs because he believed the German people were the strongest, the physical best, better than other nations, better than other races. He wanted the German people to see themselves as the master race, and that was the kind of world he wanted to build, where Germany was supreme. Many countries were actually very impressed with what Hitler was doing. Americans watched on with envy. They saw Germany rising. They saw their economy getting stronger. They saw Hitler as a fantastic leader. His work programs, his youth programs, his motorways, rebuilding German industry. In fact, American Time magazine made Hitler the Man of the Year. However, they couldn't see the concentration camps. Hitler's inner circle were just as ruthless and power-hungry as he was. Goebbels was now Minister for Propaganda. He controlled the radio, the cinema, the newspapers. He was Hitler's mouthpiece, and he could spread his anti-Semitic message across Germany to the people. But being in Hitler's inner circle was very dangerous. They all hated each other, and they all fought for more power. Rivalries started to happen. Goering hated Goebbels, Goebbels hated Goering. Goering was made head of the Gestapo, and he liked to wiretap Goebbels' phone so he could find out things about him, like when he was cheating on his wife. Goering would then tell Hitler, who frowned upon such activity, and he was forced to take action against Goebbels. But Goering was also put in charge of rebuilding the German Air Force. This was an enormous task, but he seemed to be the man with the energy to do it. However, after being shot in the leg during Hitler's failed coup in the 1920s, Goering had become addicted to morphine. He was now a drug addict. Heinrich Himmler had gone from a low-ranking bureaucrat in the Nazi Party to becoming one of the most feared men and the most powerful men in all of Germany. He was ambitious, ruthless, cold-hearted and determined. He was now the head of Hitler's elite bodyguard unit, the SS. He was feared, respected, but also despised. Rudolf Hess was deputy Führer. He was considered quiet and slightly strange and eccentric. However, his loyalty to Hitler was beyond question. With such a powerful inner circle, the Nazis were looking unstoppable. And they would have a chance to show off their power to the world as Germany hosted the 1936 Olympics in Munich. The Nazis and Hitler now had a world stage where they could showcase the power of the German people. And that's exactly what they did, with Germany winning 38 gold medals and topping the table. However, despite that, Hitler was still furious when African-American Jesse Owens won gold in the 100 meters for the United States. This went against Hitler's belief that the white man was superior to the black man, and the German was superior to all men. However, the Nazis had shown their supremacy to the world, winning more gold medals and topping the medal table overall. This began to convince the German people that they really were the master race. After the success of the 1936 Olympics, German confidence was at an all-time high, and Hitler wasn't just a politician anymore. He was almost like a messiah figure. People literally worshipped him. He was now seen as the saviour of Germany, the saviour of the Germanic race. Nazi party membership was now at an all-time high, and Hitler was looking unstoppable. He destroyed his rivals, and he brought Germany back to greatness once again. The dark days after the First World War were over. Germany was now resurgent. The German public now queued up in their millions to see the man that had saved them, the man that had saved Germany itself. On the 7th of November 1938, Hitler was given a great gift when a young Jewish boy shot dead a German diplomat called Ernst von Raff. This would send the German people into absolute outrage. Goebbels orchestrated reprisals against Jewish communities by the German people. Synagogues were burnt to the ground, shop windows were broken, businesses set on fire, as the German people took out their frustration on the Jews. It would become known as the Night of Broken Glass. Hitler was delighted by the reaction because it proved the Nazi anti-Jewish message was finally beginning to hit home. German people were turning against the Jewish community. Over 7,000 Jewish shops and over 200 synagogues were destroyed, and not only in Germany, but also in Austria. Hermann Göring himself wasn't so happy. He didn't like the destruction of valuable property. He said that he'd rather do in 200 Jews himself than see all that property destroyed. After the Second World War, Germany had been heavily punished. Parts of the country had been occupied by French troops. Other parts had been cut away and given to other countries like Poland. Hitler was determined to restore this German land. And in 1936 he took a great gamble. Even though the German army wasn't ready to take on Great Britain and France, he decided to retake the Rhineland. The Rhineland was now a demilitarized zone, which meant no German troops were allowed in it. Hitler took an enormous gamble by sending his German army into that part of the country. He gambled the British and the French would do nothing to stop him. It was a huge gamble and a huge risk, but Hitler was right. The British and French didn't want to start another war. The way they saw it, Hitler was just taking back part of Germany. He was just taking back part of his own country. They didn't see the reason in starting another war over this. But by retaking the Rhineland, Hitler went up in the estimation of the German people. This was a huge military success for him. He'd gambled and it had paid off. But more importantly, he tested the resolve of the British and French governments. They had not been willing to stop him. He now realised he might be able to take back other parts of Germany. Hitler himself was an Austrian, but Austria wasn't part of Germany. However, Hitler wanted to make it part of Germany. He had huge support in Austria, and he wanted to unite the two countries. One of Hitler's new inner circle was Martin Bormann. He used to be Hess's deputy, but had wormed his way to the top. He would become essential for Hitler. Rudolf Hess had been given the job of building Hitler's new luxury holiday home in Berghof, but he gave the job to his deputy, Martin Bormann. Bormann immediately bought up all the land around the area, but if people didn't want to sell, he had them thrown in prison until they sold their property at a lower price, all so he could build Hitler's retreat. Bormann saw this as an opportunity to get in Hitler's good books and rise to the top. Bormann had done such a great job with the Berghof that Hitler recruited him to the inner circle. Eventually, Bormann would become known as the Brown Eminence, because nobody could get an audience with Hitler without going through him. The Berghof became Hitler's go-to place when he wanted to plan or meet with high-ranking members of the Nazis in a more refined and relaxed setting. Men like Goebbels and Himmler, Goering, and even Hitler's new architect, Albert Speer, would all be invited to have an audience with Adolf Hitler and discuss their ideas. The Berghof was Hitler's go-to Nazi retreat. It was the only place he truly felt relaxed. He could meet with other Nazis in a more informal setting and discuss the future and their plans for the rest of Europe. One of the biggest plans Hitler wanted to discuss was the invasion of his home country, Austria. He knew he had massive support in his home country, and he wanted to unite the German people and the Austrian people as one. With high-ranking generals, he soon began to plan the invasion of Austria. Hitler did not expect any resistance. Although the Austrian government was against him, he knew the people were for him. He knew he had huge support in his home country. Hitler wasn't worried about the Austrian reaction. He was worried about Great Britain and France. What would they do if he invaded Austria? It would be a huge gamble. Another risk Hitler would have to take. Also, whilst at the Berghof retreat, Hitler spent time with his fiancée, Eva Braun. Not many people knew he had a fiancée because he kept it so quiet. Because he had so many female supporters, he was worried he would lose votes. But Hitler was not a man who would show public affection. He liked to keep their relationship very secluded and away from public eyes. But the Berghof was one place Hitler felt like he could truly relax, get away from all the pressure of being the emperor of the German people. But Adolf Hitler was never truly alone. He was always surrounded by elite SS bodyguards, and men like Himmler always wanted to discuss business. Here he was, with his new lieutenant, Reinhard Heydrich, a man who would carve out a fearsome reputation in the Nazi SS. Reinhard Heydrich would be one of the men brought in to discuss the final solution, or Jewish problem, how to get rid of the Jewish community. Adolf Hitler was determined to strengthen the German army so they could be more than a match for the French or the British. So he began a conscription program. German soldiers would be conscripted from average citizens. This would increase the size of the German army. The German public didn't realize it, but Hitler was already planning for a possible war. He knew his actions could upset Great Britain and France. He knew a war may have been coming, but he was prepared to gamble with the lives of his people. He'd already started youth training programs, making the Hitler Youth stronger and more powerful. That way he could have a new generation of German soldiers waiting in the wings. Adolf Hitler and the Nazis wanted to militarize Germany. They wanted the German public to become familiar with the weapons of war. They wanted to prepare them for the possible fact that Germany may be in a Second World War very soon. Hitler wanted to militarize the entire country. He'd already started his Hitler Youth programs, but he wanted everyone, from men, women and children, to be united as one in the face of a possible war against Britain and France. After World War I, restrictions were put on Germany. They weren't allowed to have an air force or an army above 100,000 men. Hitler got round this by training pilots using gliders. Whilst the pilots trained with gliders, Hermann Goering had been given the task of rebuilding the German Air Force, a task that he was now coming close to completing. The German public were becoming more and more familiar with the sounds and sights of military life. Thanks to conscription, the German army quickly grew to the size of over 2 million. They were becoming highly trained, highly motivated. After their defeat in World War I, the Germans had learnt lessons on how to use infantry, artillery, air support and tanks together in one. One of Hitler's greatest generals was Heinz Guderian. He wrote a book and pioneered the use of tanks. He believed the next war would be very different from the first one. He believed it would be faster and more mobile. Rather than a vast, slow-moving army, he pioneered the use of panzer units, small units of tanks and men with artillery and air support. They would punch through enemy lines quickly and cover great distances, surrounding enemies before they even had a chance to fight. Guderian's panzer units would be the tip of the German army's spear. Hitler also had restrictions on his navy, but he got round this by building small battleships known as pocket battleships. The Germans had also pioneered the use of U-boats in World War I, and they would expand that program in World War II. After taking back the Rhineland, in 1938, Hitler was ready to take another gamble and invade his home country of Austria. On the 12th of March 1938, Hitler issued his orders, and the German army invaded Austria. They were met with crowds of cheering people. Very few resisted. Those that did were quickly arrested and thrown in jail. But many people welcomed the Nazis. The Germans quickly occupied government buildings and radio stations. The Austrian government had protested to Britain and France, but the rest of Austria seemed to welcome the Germans with open arms. It seemed like the Austrian people were delighted to be part of Hitler's new Germany. The occupation of Austria had been a huge success. The crowds lined the streets, cheering the German soldiers, waving the Nazi flag and giving the Nazi salute. Adolf Hitler, the Nazis and the German army seemed to be welcomed like conquering heroes in Austria. Hitler had taken another gamble, and again it had paid off. He'd taken back the Rhineland, and now he'd invaded Austria. Hitler had returned home to the place of his birth. But in the end, Austria would be swallowed up by the Nazi Empire. Hitler also wanted the Sudetenland, which had been part of Czechoslovakia since the end of the First World War. The Czechs protested and were willing to fight if Britain and France backed them. But instead, Britain and France decided to let Hitler have the Sudetenland. In order to appease Hitler and avoid another world war, Neville Chamberlain, British Prime Minister, and other leaders signed a peace treaty with Adolf Hitler that would allow him to take control of the Sudetenland. Hitler had gambled again, and he was right. Britain and France had backed down. Though Neville Chamberlain thought this was a great moment in history, he believed he had averted another war. But whilst Chamberlain and the British public celebrated, Hitler was already planning his next move. As German troops marched into the Sudetenland, again to no opposition, Hitler was already planning to take over the entire country of Czechoslovakia. The population of the Sudetenland was mainly German-speaking people, so they welcomed Hitler and the German army with open arms. Hitler had taken back the Rhineland, he'd taken over Austria, and now he'd taken over the Sudetenland. Despite Hitler's assurances to Great Britain and France that he would invade no more countries, the people of Britain and France were beginning to wonder if the world would be plunged into war once again. The people of Great Britain didn't trust Hitler, despite Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain assuring them that the Germans would not invade any more countries. But as Adolf Hitler celebrated with his soldiers, he was already beginning to plan his next move, the total invasion of Czechoslovakia. Despite signing the Munich Pact with Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and agreeing not to invade any more countries, on the 15th of March 1939, Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia. The British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain now realised he'd been fooled by Hitler, and he could no longer trust him. It had become apparent Hitler wanted to build his own German empire. The people of Czechoslovakia had no defence as German troops poured into their country. Once more, Adolf Hitler had gambled the British and French didn't want a war, and once more he had won. But after the invasion of Czechoslovakia, both Britain and France realised they could no longer trust Hitler. As the people of Nazi Germany began to celebrate another stunning victory, Great Britain and France slowly began to realise that war was inevitable. Hitler could no longer be trusted, so the British and French gave him an ultimatum. If he attacked one more country, a state of war would exist between them. But Hitler thought Britain and France were bluffing. He saw Neville Chamberlain as a weak leader, a weak man. Hitler was already turning his attentions to Poland, After the First World War, parts of German territory had been given to Poland. Hitler wanted to restore this land back to Germany. Hitler believed the Allies were bluffing. He'd taken Austria and they had done nothing. He invaded Czechoslovakia and they had done nothing. Surely, if he invaded Poland, they would do nothing to stop him. Some parts of Poland had German-speaking civilians. Hitler saw these Germans and said they were being mistreated by the Polish people. This wasn't true, but this was his pretext to invade the country. In order to have more of an excuse, Hitler ordered the German army to come up with a plan, and they did. They attacked a small German radio station on the border and killed all the German people there. They then left a few dead concentration camp victims lying around, dressed in Polish uniforms. They then pretended that the radio station had been attacked by Polish troops. This enraged the German people. They believed this. They believed these Polish troops had attacked the German civilians and killed them. But of course, this was all part of the Nazis' propaganda machine. Along with this, they printed stories of German civilians on the Polish side of the border being mistreated by the Polish people. Of course, this wasn't true, but it was a great pretext to start a war. However, unlike Austria and Czechoslovakia, the Polish government were determined to fight, and Britain and France were determined to back them. Of course, the British and French wanted to help Poland, but they knew if Hitler invaded, there was very little they could do. The British had a professional pre-war army, but it was only 300,000 men strong. The French had millions in their army, mainly conscripts. So did the Germans. They had an army of 2 million. But the French wouldn't fight the Germans unless the Germans invaded their country. With only an army of about 300,000 men, Britain were no match for the Germans in terms of numbers. France were, but again, they wouldn't invade Germany unless Germany invaded France. This left Poland alone. Even though the Polish army were prepared to fight, they were no match for the modernised German divisions that would be flung against them. As the German army mobilised, the world held its breath as Hitler prepared to gamble once again. It had been 21 years since the end of the Great War. But now one of the soldiers that survived that war, Adolf Hitler, was about to plunge the world into another.